The wrongness of it was clipped to my daughter's hospital bassinet in a strip of yellow plastic that said social hold. I'm Hannah Doyle, 32 years old, and while I was lying in a trauma room with glass still in my hair, after a crash on Gun Barrel Road, my parents told a pediatric nurse they would not take my 13-day-old baby for the night. My mother's first question was whether the car seat base had cracked, not whether May was breathing, not whether I could feel my legs. The car seat base, when the social worker leaned over my bed and said, very gently, "We've documented that maternal grandparents declined." I felt something inside me go still in a way I had never felt before. If you've ever tried to explain away the first red flag because the people waving it were family, stay with me. I did that for years, and if I had trusted my own discomfort sooner, that day might still have broken my heart, but it wouldn't have surprised me. At the time, all I knew was that my newborn daughter had been medically cleared faster than I had, and because I couldn't stand up without vomiting from the concussion, she could not be discharged to me. My husband Aaron was 5 hours away in Augusta on storm restoration after a line collapse, driving back the second he got service. His Aunt Denise was at least 45 minutes out in Cleveland, Tennessee. My parents lived 19 minutes from the hospital. 19. By the time my grandfather Walter walked into pediatrics that afternoon, carrying May's yellow duck blanket over one arm and a hard blue document case in his hand, I understood that my parents had not simply failed me in a crisis. They had used my crisis for something, and the proof of that had been building in plain sight for months. The accident happened on a Friday, March 14, at 8:12 in the morning. I know the exact minute because it's in the police report, in the EMS note, and in the lock screen photo Aaron took when he saved every record afterward in one album labeled Mark 14. We are those people now, the kind who save timestamps because our peace depends on memory being stronger than performance. I had taken May to a weight check at Pediatric Diagnostic Associates because she had come a little early at 37 weeks, and our pediatrician wanted one more follow-up after a bout of mild jaundice. She weighed 6 pounds, 11 ounces that morning. I remember because I kissed the side of her head and said, "You're finally proving everybody wrong." And the nurse laughed. It had rained before dawn, and the roads still had that dark, slick shine that makes every traffic light feel longer than it is. I was turning through Gun Barrel and Shallowford on green when a landscaping truck cut the light from the left. Not fast enough to turn the whole thing cinematic, not slow enough to spare us. Just fast enough for the passenger side to crumple, the airbags to burst with that burning chemical smell, and the world to become powder, noise, and seatbelt pressure. May was behind me. That was the only sentence left in my head. May was behind me. People talk about adrenaline as if it's heroic. It isn't. It's primitive. It makes you do math and prayer at the same time. I couldn't open my door. My wrist went useless the second I tried to brace. I twisted hard enough to feel pain rip up my neck, and all I could see at first was one tiny white sock kicking above the gray straps. Then I heard her cry. That sound saved me. A woman from the car behind us kept saying, "Don't move, honey, don't move," while a man in a navy fleece climbed into the back from the opposite side and checked the car seat angle. Someone called 911. Someone else held my phone near my face so I could use Face ID with shaking eyes. I called my mother first. I wish there were a noble reason for that. There wasn't. It was habit. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding distracted, the way people sound when they are searching for scissors in a junk drawer. "Hannah, I've been hit," I said. "I'm at Gun Barrel and Shallowford. They're taking May and me to Erlanger. Can you meet us there?" Her pause was small. Not horrified. Not panicked. Evaluating. "Is the baby injured?" "They don't know yet. They're checking her." "Mom, please just come." Then came the question I will hear for the rest of my life in her exact tone. Did the car seat take the impact on her side or the base? I remember closing my eyes because even then, bleeding into my collar, I understood what that meant about her priorities. The whole seat has to be replaced. The man holding my phone snapped before I could answer. "Mom, just get to the hospital." My mother inhaled in a way I knew too well, offended. "Not by crash." "By being corrected. We're on our way," she said and hung up. That should have been the end of the uncertainty. It wasn't even the beginning. At Erlanger, they separated us fast. May went through pediatric evaluation because of her age and because any baby in a collision gets treated like a problem you never assume is small. I went to adult trauma for scans, wrist imaging, and monitoring because I blacked out once while they were transferring me. My right wrist was badly sprained, 2 fingers needed stitches, I had a concussion, and my chest looked like someone had painted a seatbelt across it in bruise-colored ink. Asking for May, a nurse named Leslie, who had the calmest face I have ever seen, kept answering me in complete sentences, which I now know is what good nurses do when the world stops making sense. May's oxygen is fine. May is crying appropriately. May's CT is not indicated right now. May is with pediatrics and a neonatal nurse is with her. Then, around 10:05, she asked, "Who can take your baby if they discharge her before you're cleared?" "My parents," I said immediately. "Colleen and Martin Doyle, they're coming." Leslie nodded and typed. At 10:32, she came back with a different expression. Not alarmed, something flatter. "I spoke with pediatrics," she said. "Your parents have not arrived yet. They said they wanted to wait for more information." I thought I was still in that foggy stage, where simple things sound harder than they are. Wait for what? She shifted the computer slightly, glancing at the screen. They told the pediatric nurse they are not comfortable taking a newborn overnight and would prefer the paternal side-handle discharge. I remember the fluorescent lights above me, the hum from the vent, the pulse monitor beeping as if this were all logistical. "No," I said. "That's a mistake." She didn't argue. She just said, "Would you like me to call them again from here?" That is the thing about humiliation in adulthood. It rarely enters dramatically. It arrives wearing a badge and speaking softly. I said yes. Leslie called on speaker because my left hand was shaking too hard to hold the phone. My father answered. "Mr. Doyle, this is Leslie from Erlanger. I'm with your daughter Hannah. We need to confirm discharge support for her infant daughter May if the child is cleared before Hannah is." My father did not sound like a man at the hospital entrance. He sounded like a man in a house. "Well, we talked to someone upstairs," he said. "The baby should stay where the baby is until the husband gets back." "There may be several hours before the father arrives," Leslie said. "The child is stable but cannot remain indefinitely without a caregiver plan." He exhaled through his nose. "I could picture it perfectly. I don't know what you expect us to do. We're not set up for a 2-week-old. Hannah's dramatic when she gets scared. If she needs rest, then the hospital is the safest place." I tried to sit up too fast. My head went hot and white. "Dad," I said. He kept going, because once people think they are justified, they become astonishingly comfortable in front of witnesses. And Aaron's people need to start stepping up. We're not doing this thing where our whole life gets commandeered because she had a baby with a man who's always gone. Leslie's face didn't change, but she looked at me once, briefly, with something like pity. My father heard my breath hitch and finally stopped. "Hannah," he said, suddenly gentler, because now the audience included me. Then I said the only true thing I could say. "You live 19 minutes away." He was quiet for one beat too long. Then my mother got on the line and said, "We can come visit. We are not taking charge of a breastfed newborn in the middle of this mess." Visit, as if my daughter were in recovery from a dental procedure, and I was being unreasonable about scheduling. I wanted to tell you I fought then. That I became sharp and articulate and fearless in the exact moment it counted. I didn't. I cried. Not loudly, not theatrically. Just 2 embarrassed tears sliding into the hairline while a nurse I had met an hour earlier documented my parents' refusal in a chart. Leslie ended the call and said, "We'll keep working the list." The list. There is something brutal about becoming administrative. When people hear stories like this later, they always ask the wrong question first. They ask if my parents had always been cruel. The answer is no, not in the obvious way. If they had been obvious, I might have left earlier. My parents specialized in smaller injuries, the kind you could explain away with stress, generation gaps, poor timing. That's just how they are. My mother, Colleen, was 70% charm and 30% appetite. She chaired meal trains at church, wrote long condolence cards in blue ink, and never forgot a birthday for anyone she wanted credit with. My father, Martin, had the heavy-footed competence people mistake for reliability. He could install crown molding without a level and make you feel irrational for noticing he never showed up on the day he promised. They were not monsters. They were worse for me than that, because they were believable. They had raised me on a phrase my mother loved whenever money, labor, or accountability appeared. Family doesn't need receipts. Dawn. She said it when I was 19 and covering groceries for a weekend that turned into 3 months after my father's decking business lost a contract. She said it when I drove my grandfather Walter to cardiology because my father couldn't leave the yard. She said it when she used the $240 I had sent for my grandmother's birthday flowers to pay for an emergency plumber and told me she would settle it later. Family doesn't need receipts. What she meant was, don't write down what we take from you. Don't embarrass us by remembering it. By the time I was pregnant with May, I had started noticing how often that sentence showed up just before I lost time, money, or peace. Not enough to call it abuse. Enough to feel tired. My pregnancy had not been easy. I had hyperemesis until week 22, then borderline blood pressure issues near the end, which meant more appointments, more monitoring, and more people telling me to reduce stress as if stress were a lamp I could unplug. Aaron tried. He really did. But he works for a utility contractor, and storm season doesn't consult my nervous system. He took every hour he could after May was born, then got sent to Augusta 6 days later when a line collapse knocked out 3 counties. He cried in the kitchen before he left, standing in his socks with a travel mug in one hand and May's discharge papers in the other, saying, "I hate this. I hate this so much." I believed him. My parents loved using his absence as moral evidence. At my baby shower, which my mother insisted on hosting at our church fellowship hall because my house was too small for real hospitality, she had monogrammed sugar cookies done in pale sage and cream. Beautiful, expensive, carefully boxed. Each one said Baby Doyle. My daughter's last name is Bell. I noticed it when I saw the dessert table, all lined up under eucalyptus garland and rented risers, my own name erased in icing by my own mother, because she could not stand that Aaron and I had chosen to keep our names and hyphenate nothing. When I pulled her aside, she touched my elbow like I was being hormonal in public. "Oh, Hannah, don't make a whole thing. Everybody knows whose baby this is." That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. Everybody knows whose baby this is. Not yours, ours. She also changed the invitation wording after I had approved the first draft. I found out because my friend Cora forwarded me the PDF from her email to ask if the registry link was correct. The first version had said, "Please join us in celebrating Hannah and Aaron as they welcome May in early March." The version my mother sent to everyone else said, "Join the Doyle family as we prepare for our newest little girl." It was subtle enough that if I objected, I would sound petty. That was her gift. To do things just small enough that my discomfort looked unreasonable under fluorescent lighting. A week before May was born, my father dropped off a second-hand rocking chair he had promised to tighten and refinish for the nursery. He set it in the doorway, looked at the half-painted accent wall Aaron had rushed to finish before leaving, and said, "You're going to need more help than you think." It sounded kind until he added, "Maybe once the baby's here, you'll understand why your mother had to make practical decisions all those years." I asked what that meant. He looked past me into the house, toward the hallway closet where I kept files, and said, "You'll see." At the time, I thought he was talking about motherhood in that broad, smug way older people sometimes do, as if suffering grants them editorial rights over your life. Now I know he was laying track. When May was born on February 28 at 7:41 p.m., she was tiny, furious, and perfect. Her right ear folded a little at the top. Her fingernails looked painted because the beds were so pink. Aaron cut the cord with shaking hands and kissed my forehead hard enough to leave a damp spot by my temple. It was the happiest I had ever been and the most animal. Everything smelled like hospital soap, lanolin, and terror. My mother visited the next morning wearing a cream cardigan, gold hoops, and lipstick the exact color of dry roses. She brought a bouquet and 3 women from church before I had even slept 90 consecutive minutes. She announced to the room that May had my chin and the Doyle stare. Then took 37 photos, posted one before I approved it, and seemed sincerely hurt when I asked her to delete the shot where my gown was open at the shoulder and my breast pump parts were visible on the tray. "Oh, Hannah," she said, "no one is looking at you." It is hard to explain how cruel a sentence can be when the cruelty is coated in air. The second day home was worse. Aaron and I were learning the impossible economy of newborn time. 2-hour feed windows, diapers that somehow leaked sideways, the way adults become irrational when sleep drops below a certain threshold. My parents came by for 10 minutes and stayed an hour and 26. My mother kissed May's cheek after I explicitly asked everyone not to kiss her face yet. My father walked through the kitchen opening cabinets like he was measuring them for a renovation I had not requested. When I said I needed to feed the baby, my mother sighed, like I had interrupted a pleasant visit with one of my many personal hobbies. Before she left, she opened my fridge, frowned at the labeled bags of expressed milk, and said, "I don't know how anyone's supposed to help you if you insist on making the baby so dependent on you." Dependent on me. She meant breastfed. She also meant not available to be redistributed according to her preference. I should tell you about the yellow duck blanket because that mattered more than almost anything in the end. My grandfather Walter made it for May. Not bought. Made. My grandmother Ruth had crocheted blankets for every baby in the family until arthritis curled her fingers too badly to hold a hook for long. She died 3 years before May was born. After she died, Walter started teaching himself small things in the evenings because he said the house got too quiet after 6. He learned how to hem kitchen towels, replace buttons, and, eventually, very badly crochet by following YouTube videos on an iPad my cousin set up for him. The blanket he made May was buttery yellow with 4 misshapen ducks stitched across one corner in orange thread. One duck had a lopsided beak and one looked, honestly, more like a boot. It was absurd and tender in equal measure. My mother laughed when she saw it at the shower. "Well," she said, pinching the edge, "at least babies can't critique craftsmanship." Walter heard her. He only smiled and said, "Love doesn't have to be neat." That line came back to me later in a way that felt almost surgical, because if love didn't have to be neat, cruelty certainly didn't have to be loud. A lot of the months before the accident were like that. Not dramatic, just wrong in ways that accumulated. My parents repeatedly volunteered me to handle things for Walter because I was the one who knows where papers are. Prescription refill calls, appointment calendars, sorting Medicare statements, reconciling whether the assisted living brochure he'd taken from church was curiosity or actual interest. Walter was still living independently in the brick ranch on North Crest, still driving during daylight, still mowing his own back patch in straight military rows, but he had had one fall in January after slipping on the garage step. Nothing broken, thank God. Just enough to frighten all of us. Enough, too, to start a new season of interest from my parents. My father suddenly cared a great deal about getting ahead of the paperwork. My mother started saying things like, "We all need to know where everything stands," which sounded communal until you noticed she never included me in the calls where we all supposedly discussed anything. Twice that February, I was left off group texts about Walter's appointments, even though I was the person taking him. Once, I arrived to drive him to cardiology and found my father already there, not to help, but to ask Walter whether he had ever thought about simplifying his accounts. Walter was a retired county records clerk. There are men who enjoy paperwork, and then there was my grandfather, who believed a labeled folder could restore moral order to the universe. He kept mortgage statements from houses he no longer owned and user manuals for appliances that had died in the first Bush administration. If he wanted to simplify something, he would have started with his spice cabinet, not his bank access. After that cardiology appointment, he asked me to stop for coffee at a little place off Hickson Pike, where they still printed receipts on paper thin enough to read through. He set his cup down and said, "Your father has been asking questions that don't belong to him." I didn't push. With Walter, silence usually brought the rest. He wanted to know whether the deed on the house was still in my name alone. Then he asked if I'd considered adding a convenience signer on my checking account. "What did you say?" "That I've considered a great many things, including locking my desk." I laughed, but only because the alternative was naming my discomfort. He reached into the front pocket of his canvas organizer and slid me a cream business card. Janice Bell, estate planning and probate. "Would you drive me there next Wednesday?" he asked. I did, and that, more than any single cruel sentence in the hospital, was the beginning of the bigger truth. Walter met with Janice on February 26, 2 days before May was born. I waited in the reception area under a watercolor print of a courthouse, and filled out my own maternity leave email between contractions I was pretending were not contractions. He was in there for an hour and 13 minutes. When he came out, he looked both tired and relieved. In the parking lot, he sat in my car without putting on his seatbelt and said, "I've let sentiment make me sloppy." I turned the heat down because I was suddenly sweating. He told me he had amended his will and his revocable trust. He had also signed updated medical power of attorney forms. Nothing dramatic, he said. Just making the paper match reality. Reality, as he described it, was this. Over the previous 6 years, he had loaned my parents money repeatedly. Not gifts, loans. He had the transfers, the checks, and in 3 cases, actual promissory notes my father signed and never mentioned again. The total. Once Janice added in the property tax payment, Walter had covered for them in 2022, and a private loan to help my sister Leah through her divorce that my mother had routed through their account was $42,860. I stared at him. He stared back. "I know," he said. "Did Dad think you forgot?" He thought I wouldn't formalize it. That sounded exactly right. Walter had changed his trust so that his estate would still be divided among the grandchildren as he always intended, but any outstanding debt owed by my parents would be accounted for and offset against what would otherwise pass through my father's line. He also named me successor trustee and his medical agent if he became incapacitated, because, in his words, "You don't flinch from forms." I told him he should choose whoever made him comfortable. He gave me a look over the top of his glasses. That was me being diplomatic. Mom, Janice printed an extra copies for Walter to keep at home and 1 sealed set for me to place in my fireproof lockbox because the originals were filed at her office and scanned into her system. My lockbox was hard blue plastic with a combination dial Aaron insisted we buy after a pipe leak the previous year. Insurance papers, passports, my teaching contract, the house deed, and now Walter's copies all went inside. When I brought the box in from the car that day, my mother happened to be at my house dropping off a bag of hand-me-down onesies from church. She saw it and laughed. "What are you, the county clerk now?" "Just storing some papers for Grandpa." She rolled her eyes. Family doesn't need to turn everything into paperwork. The phrase landed differently that time. I still didn't know how differently until March 14, after Leslie documented my parents' refusal. The rest of that morning stretched like wet elastic. The trauma team wanted to keep me because of the concussion, and because every time I sat up, I got sick. Pediatrics cleared May medically around 11:20, but could not release her because I could not stand. My husband was out of town, and the maternal grandparents on file had declined. Denise, Aaron's aunt, said she was coming the second she got off Highway 60, but she was nearly 50 minutes away and would need the hospital to approve discharge to her with ID and written permission. It was all manageable in theory. In practice, it felt like drowning 1 clause at a time. At 11:14, my phone lit up with a text from my mother. "Do you remember where you put your grandfather's lawyer packet? He asked your dad to grab it while we're near the house." I stared at the message so long Leslie asked if I was all right. Nothing in my body was all right. But that text cut through the pain haze with icy precision. Why would Walter ask my father to grab legal documents from my house while I was in the hospital? I texted back with one hand, "Why are you at my house?" No answer. Then, 2 minutes later, getting the baby's things. Don't spiral. There are moments when your life splits before you have enough information to explain why. This was one. Up to then, I had been concentrating on the injury of the refusal, the humiliation, the abandonment. But the second I saw that text, a different part of my mind woke up. The part that kept receipts in labeled envelopes since college because my mother once forgot she had borrowed my rent check. The part that knew exactly which shelf in the hallway closet held the lockbox and exactly who had watched me put Walter's envelope inside. I called him immediately. No answer. I called again. Voicemail. Walter didn't always hear the first ring, and he refused to carry his phone in his pocket because he said it made him feel like livestock. I called my father voicemail. My mother voicemail. I still could not prove anything then. All I had was a wrong-shaped text and a stomach full of hospital ice chips. But unease has its own intelligence. When Leslie came back to check my pupils, I asked, "If someone takes belongings from my house without permission, does that matter to anyone right now?" She paused, clearly trying to assess whether I was concussed enough to be inventing problems. "It can matter," she said carefully. "Do you think that's happening?" "I think my parents told the hospital they couldn't take my baby, but they had time to go through my closet." She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Would you like social work to come back?" Social work, I learned that day, is what happens when your private pain enters a system and the system needs a category for it. Marin came in a few minutes later. She was maybe 40, with silver at her temples and the kind of posture that suggested she had seen every family configuration shame can create. She asked practical questions first. Was there anyone else to authorize? Could Aaron's aunt identify herself? Did I feel safe at home once discharged? Were my parents listed as emergency contacts out of preference or habit? That last one almost made me laugh. Out of habit. What a generous phrase for generational damage. I showed her the text from my mother. She read it once, handed me the phone back, and said, "That is not a normal text to send during an emergency involving your daughter and your newborn." I nearly started crying again just from hearing someone say it plainly. "No," I said, "it's not." She asked whether Walter knew anything about this lawyer packet. "I don't think so." Then when he answers, she said, "Ask him directly. And if your parents arrive, let us know before they come into either room." That mattered later. At 12:07, Walter finally called back. He sounded out of breath. "Hannah, Grandpa, did you ask Mom and Dad to get your legal papers from my house?" A silence, then, very quietly, "No." Cold spread through me so fast it felt chemical. "Why?" He didn't answer that question. Instead, he said, "I'm on my way to your house now." "Why?" "Because your father's truck is there." Something in his voice made me stop asking. "All right," I whispered. "I'll call you back." He hung up. I lay there listening to the monitor mark my heart faster than I felt it in my chest. Leslie came in once with anti-nausea medication, and I barely registered the sting in my IV. Marin arranged discharge authorization for Denise just in case. Pediatrics called once to say May had taken 15 milliliters by bottle from donor milk and was sleeping. Sleeping. My daughter under hospital lights, because my parents had decided to outsource compassion until it suited them. 27 minutes later, Walter called again. This time I could hear my father in the background, not words. Tone, that tight, angry male tone that means a story is collapsing. Walter said only this: "I'm bringing what matters to the hospital. Do not discuss anything with them until I get there." "What happened?" Another pause. "I found them in your dining room with your lockbox on the table." The world narrowed until all I could see was the chip in the paint on the metal bed rail beside me. "They said they were looking for baby supplies," he went on. "The baby supplies were untouched in the entryway." My mouth dried out. "Were the papers?" "I have them." That was when I understood this had not been improvised in a morning. It had been gathering shape for months. You do not refuse a 13-day-old grandchild in a hospital. Take your injured daughter's keys. Go to her house. Bypass the diaper bag by the front door and begin opening a document box unless some part of you has already decided what kind of person you are willing to be. The dread changed flavor after that. Before, I had been shocked and hurt. After Walter's call, I was alert, not stronger, not calmer, just awake in a way I could not undo. Marin came back, and I told her. Every detail I had, my parents' refusal, the text. Walter finding them with the lockbox. She wrote in clean block notes while I spoke. When I finished, she said, "I'm going to ask that if they return, they meet with staff first." I nodded. At 1:40, Denise arrived. She came straight from work in navy scrubs, and a fleece with her clinic logo on the sleeve, hair still clipped up, cheeks red from the drive. She went to pediatrics first, showed ID, signed what they needed, and then came down to see me before taking May home. She stood by my bed and said the kindest, most devastating thing anyone said to me all day. "Honey, nobody should have had to call around for your baby while you were being scanned." I covered my face with my left hand and sobbed for the first time without embarrassment. Denise let me cry. She didn't defend anybody. She didn't say, "I'm sure they meant well." She just held the rail and waited until I could breathe again. Then she told me May was all right. Tiny scratch near the car seat buckle, probably from debris, a little fussy. Hungry. Beautiful. "Your grandfather's up there now," she added. I looked up. He beat me by maybe 10 minutes. That image is one I still return to when I need to remember what love actually does. An 80-year-old man with a bad left knee and bifocals, getting to the pediatric floor before the two healthy adults who lived 19 minutes away. Walter came into my room at 2:18, carrying the yellow duck blanket over his arm like it was a formal garment. The hard blue document case was tucked under the other arm. He had changed out of his work boots into loafers, which meant he had gone home just long enough to steady himself before coming. He set the case on the chair, laid the blanket gently at the foot of my bed, and looked at me long enough that I felt 6 years old again and guilty for skinning my knee. Instead, he said, "How bad?" "Concussion, wrist." He nodded once. "And May?" "Okay, with Denise soon." "Good." Then he sat down and told me exactly what happened. He had driven to my house after my second call because he knew I had a pediatric appointment that morning. And because, in his words, "Your mother lies most cleanly when she thinks there won't be witnesses." When he pulled up, my father's truck was in the driveway. The front door was unlocked. He walked in without knocking because it was family and because he had a key from the time Aaron was out of town during my last blood pressure scare. The diaper bag was on the entry bench. The extra sleeper I kept packed for emergencies was still hanging on the peg by the laundry room. My breast pump bag was on the kitchen chair. The baby things were untouched. My parents were in the dining room with the lockbox on the table, the closet shelf liner beside it, and my father's flathead screwdriver in his hand. Walter said my mother had the sealed manila envelope from Janice already half out of the file. "What did they say?" I asked. Walter adjusted his glasses and looked at the floor for a second before answering. "Your mother said they were trying to make sure your father understood what I had signed before you got emotional and turned everyone against each other." "Even injured?" I almost laughed. It was such a perfect Colleen sentence. "Accuse the other person of the exact manipulation you are performing." "And Dad?" He said if the copies disappeared, Janice couldn't force the issue without reopening the conversation. That sentence did something ugly and clarifying inside me. My father thought stealing copies from my house might